Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pathways to Excellence. Today we have a very special guest with us right here. We have Miss Wan Nadiah, the president of the Harvard Club of Malaysia. It's an absolute honor to have you with us here today. Thank you so much for making the time amid the, I guess, health crisis.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, Pathways is an education podcast, and one of the things that we do like to showcase is educational outcomes that are, I guess, on the far end of the extreme. Would you, I guess, share with us a little bit about, well, how you personally came to know about Harvard and what eventually led you to apply?
Basically, I went to national school. So
National
I
school.
did primary and secondary school in Petaling Jaya in a national school. And then I at the time when I graduated with SPM, it was 2001. September 11 had just happened. And a lot of my friends were hearing a lot of stories about how, it was very difficult for Muslims to go to the United States and they weren't thinking of applying there. And my very simplistic thinking thought, well, if nobody's going to apply to go, the chances of me getting a scholarship to go there would be much higher.
Wow.
I applied for the JPA scholarship, the Public Services Department scholarship, to go to the US. And I actually didn't get the scholarship in the first round. So I actually entered matriculation in University Malaya. So I was given a spot in Asasi Science in University Malaya, which is the foundation year for their science program. But then in the middle of my matriculation, I think there was a second batch of students that received confirmation. So then I got my scholarship to go to the US to study biochemistry, or rather they called it a scholarship for biotechnology. So during that time, the Prime Minister was Tun Abdullah Badawi, and he had this project called the Bio Valley. So the government was actually sponsoring a lot of students to go and study biotech so that they could come back and work in this field. So I got the scholarship, and then as part of the scholarship, I had to do an American degree program at InTech in UITM. So that's where I went. I did my American degree program, set for my SATs, and applied. And JPA has this policy where they give you a scholarship for a particular subject, then you have to apply for the top 3 universities in that field. So obviously in biology, it was Harvard, MIT, Yale. So I ended up applying to 8 different schools, like Johns Hopkins, Chicago. I was so worried I wouldn't get anywhere. I applied to State University of New York in Buffalo. But anyway, yeah, so that's how I ended up applying to Harvard and sort of miraculously got in. So I did my undergrad degree there in biochemistry. When I came back and reported back to the Public Services Department, unfortunately, the Prime Minister had changed. The project was no longer on. They didn't have jobs for us. So I ended up working in management consulting because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. And I worked there for 2 years before I decided to take a sabbatical, do my master's in London. And I came back and started working with different companies in Malaysia.
I can imagine, yeah. Wow. So it sounds like it's been quite the journey right there. So it's been a long journey, but I guess if you were to identify a single highlight, the first thing that comes to your mind, the first memory, the immediate one that is salient, what would it be?
So when I was at Harvard, basically freshman year, they had this program that was sponsored by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute that was kind of designed to allow students from less advantaged or disadvantaged backgrounds to perform research, because they would essentially, I think the whole thing with access is that a lot of people can't afford to do all the things that you expect high performing students to do. They don't have the connections to get internships. They can't afford to take free internships because they have to pay for transport and expenses somehow. And so I think the program was we would pay you so that you can afford to do research in a lab.
I see.
And so I actually ended up doing research for 4 years in a lab at Boston Children's Hospital,
Wow.
studying the protein structure of rotavirus because we were developing a vaccine for rotavirus. And my supervisor, or the head of the lab at the time, Phil Dormitzer, eventually went on to be head of vaccines at Pfizer. And I think it was a very interesting time for him over COVID. But yeah, so I think there's few things that really stuck in my mind about Harvard is just like the extent of opportunities and the kind of programs that they have to ensure that you give access to people as much as possible and think about what are the things that are holding people back, right? Because it's
Mm,
very easy to say like meritocracy, we should just give scholarships to people who score the most A's, but what are the things that are holding people back? Like maybe, and when we do Harvard interviews, that's a question that's always at the back of our minds. It's like, maybe this student isn't like, super straight A student, but what other circumstances in their life is impacting that? Are they responsible to earn an income for their family? Are they caretakers for somebody ill?
mm,
Do they come from a disadvantaged background? So it's always asking the deeper level questions. And so I think I was enormously lucky that I had all these opportunities at Harvard where not only was I able to do research, I applied for grants to study Spanish and hallucinogenic plants in Costa Rica one summer. Uh, so
wow.
it's
Sounds like a
so
very diverse
much
crop of experiences.
resources, right? Yeah, I mean, and there's just so many things that you could do, and it's really there's no limit to your imagination or what you can do if you're willing.
Fascinating. What do you feel was, I guess, the most unexpected thing that you discovered that you could do, but you did not know that you could do before you went to Harvard?
Okay, so I came from a family. I mean, we were middle class, but we didn't have a lot of additional income to do things like music lessons, for example. So
Mm-mm.
when I went to Harvard, like because it's a liberal arts education, what that means is that you break it up into thirds. Like a third of your classes are related to
Mm.
your concentration or your major. Another third of your classes have to be things that are outside your major, because the whole point about liberal arts is they want to develop students who are holistic. And so for me, as a science student, I had to take classes in literature and arts, language, things that were outside of the sciences, so that when you graduate, at least 2/3 of your degree, only a third would be
Mm.
your major, a third would be unrelated, but things that they deem as important to be an educated person, right, in
Mm.
society. And then the other third, they actually left it to you to decide. Like you could do more of the things that you are interested in, or you could do something completely different. And so when I went to Harvard, it was like, it's akin to like drinking from a fire hose. There's just so many things that in fact it can be quite intimidating and
Mm.
confusing. But I ended up taking the opportunity to actually explore a lot of things that I never had the opportunity back home in Malaysia, like studying politics and philosophy. Like a lot of people talk in Malaysia about communists and communism, but nobody really
Understands.
studies the political philosophy of communism. What
Sure.
did Karl Marx actually think? I did classes in history of art. I did
Mm.
classes in literature. I did classes
Mm.
in music. And I thought that was actually really important because at the end of the day, I realized that I worked in a lab for 4 years, but maybe research wasn't for me because research is something that's very intensely focused on a particular topic. And I found that myself as a person, I was more interested in the larger picture and
Mm.
so all these classes actually they helped expose me to very different ways of thinking, different ways of communicating,
Mm.
seeing things from a different point of view. I know I've been amazingly lucky that I've had this opportunities to actually interact with these cool professors and learn from my classmates on topics that I mean, medieval architecture, it's you would never have that opportunity to really like study that and really
Mm.
understand what was going on in the Middle Ages, Charlemagne, whatever. And it just gives you a greater appreciation and understanding of yourself as a person, not just a Malaysian, but a citizen of a wider world.
Absolutely. And one thing I discovered recently is that you can apparently take a class on Taylor Swift at Harvard. Have you heard about that?
So, well, the thing is at Harvard is that they change the classes all the time. And what was
Mm,
really special about it is that the first 2 weeks of class is actually called shopping week.
hmm.
And students literally, like, you can walk in and out of a class. You're shopping the class. You're
Sure.
you're attending, and if you don't like it in the first 5 minutes, you leave. And then you're just trying it out. And then you decide which of the classes you want to take at the end of shopping week. Then you officially sign up. And we
Mm,
had course catalogs, and we had Q guides, which were basically reviews written by students of the
mm-hmm,
courses and the professors. And so you had all these points of research and information that you could do to
mm,
like find out all these cool classes. And the classes change a lot. So Taylor Swift was not there at the time, but I did a class on parasites. I did a class on food. Like I said, I did a class on medieval architecture, history
ooh,
of music. So it's really like the whole thing about the liberal arts education is empowering the student to decide what topic of intellectual interest do they want to explore and then
mm,
just go for it.
right. That's interesting. I guess you get to decide the kind of character that you become then. And I like to then ask, I guess, since it was something that you mentioned before, like the idea of essentially becoming an educated person. Now, well, you've been essentially to Harvard. That's very obviously a well-known educational institution. And now I want to know, I guess, your thoughts on what it means to be an educated person in society. Of course, like the word education in itself, right? It refers to like drawing something out, right? But there are so many different pathways, I guess, that a person could possibly take. Is there an ideal vision of what an educated person should be, or
Human beings live as part of a society, right? And I
mm,
feel like the purpose in life should be to actually contribute something to make the society better. And so
mm,
I feel like an educated person is really thinking and knowing what you can do to perform your duty and responsibility as a member of society. So,
mm,
for example, like I think civil education is really important. Like when I was in the US, I took classes on American public policy because you are living in that country. But if you do not understand how their government works,
mm,
if you do not understand the history of the Supreme Court, the Constitution, you don't have an appreciation of why the society is like that and how
mm,
you can contribute as a person who's living in that country and what's your role in that society.
mm,
And so the first thing I think an educated person is you need to understand how these things work. You need to
mm,
understand how the society, what are building blocks of society, how it functions, and then you can figure out how you can contribute in your own way. So that's number one. And that's not just about policy or politics. It's also about, ethics, etiquette. Why is it important people don't throw rubbish into the drains? I mean, the fact that you need to teach people to be considerate about other people and
mm,
how like your individual actions can have an impact on a collective,
mm.
understanding that role is actually the hallmark, I think, of a civilized and educated person.
I
Right?
see.
Because I
Mm,
think knowing facts and figures and all that is all well and good. But honestly, with the internet, like anyone can Google
mhm,
facts, right? So I think what's important is like being able to see things, being able to see the impact of things and the impact of your actions, the impacts of
mhm,
what's happening outside in the world and how that would change the situation and the country and the community where you are.
mhm,
I think that's more important. And normally people say that's critical thinking, and then you try and figure out like how do you teach it. But I think what's important is that it's really difficult to teach the how if people don't understand the why
mm,
it's important.
I see. Okay, thank you for that. Principles for contributing to society. Thank you for that, Nadia. So, as you kind of think through your kind of journey to Harvard and beyond it so far, I guess in your own way, do you feel that there has been some sort of undergirding principle or a set of values by which you've thought to contribute to society? And how do you feel that that's manifested, I guess, like in life, career, everything that you choose to do?
I guess I have a few core principles. Number one is don't do anything you'll regret, which essentially means I think you'll be safe if you stick to moral and ethical principles, because
Right.
regardless, sometimes it could be easier not to. But at the end of the day, it could always come back and bite you in the ass. That's number one. Number two, I think being curious is important
Hmm?
because life isn't static, the world isn't static, and you always need to have the sort of curiosity to ask why, what's going to happen next.
Hmm.
And if you don't, then I feel like you're not really living, right? You're just like passively experiencing life rather than
Interesting.
actively trying to discover and make your own way in the world.
I see.
Um, and thirdly, I think it's about leaving wherever you are a better place than before you came, right? I
Mm,
mean, we are only here on Earth for a very short period of time comparatively. Obviously, you want to leave the place a better place than when you came, because
mm.
so then the net effect has been to move forward rather than backwards, I guess.
Wonderful. And so when you think about then our current society, do you feel that there are certain questions that you feel that you have personally been interested in exploring increasingly over the years? And I guess, yeah, like what might those questions be for you personally as well?
The thing that really is occupying my mind right now, and I just signed up for a marketing and analytics course, is that so much of our life is like influenced by algorithms that are actually designed. And sometimes even the designers don't understand how these algorithms come about. Like
Mm,
you have machine learning, you have data sets, and then you have a specific outcome, but
hmm.
it's a black box in between how the algorithm ties the data to the result. But
Mm.
so much of our life is being determined by all of this that sometimes I wonder, like, it's essentially like the Matrix. Like, how much of this is actually real and how much of it is actually self-perpetuating illusion? Yeah, so I think it's fascinating because like people's behavior,
Uh-huh.
incentives, the
Mm,
interconnection between their lives online and their lives offline.
mm,
um yeah, we are facing so many other issues. I mean, the thing is like when I was at Harvard, I think Obama was being elected president, and there was this whole
mm.
thing about Cambridge Analytica, that scandal about how Facebook, then Meta, was influencing elections. And I
Featuring your
think,
classmate, Mark Zuckerberg.
well, he's 1 year older, yeah. uh, but Vivek Ramaswamy, the presidential candidate, was my classmate. Um,
Okay.
anyway, so there's so many things about our world right now that is really interesting to sort of like analyze. I feel
Hmm.
so the sort of questions that we ask. But on the other hand, like I don't want to be pessimistic as well, because I can see like how technology has really enabled us to do amazing things. The differences that I see between students I interview now and students I interviewed 10 years ago. Students you interview now, a lot of what they do, the passions that they pursue is entirely self-driven and self-directed. And they can do that because they have so much access to resources online that it doesn't matter
Mm,
that they come from a small town. Doesn't matter if they come from Ipoh or Kuching, but they have access to resources that someone in London or KL will have.
mm,
And they can teach themselves to code. They can teach themselves to create apps and services and
mm,
create battery cells because they saw a YouTube video. And I think it's just fascinating how much you can do if a
mhm,
person's curious enough and willing to put in the effort. But
mm.
at the same time, I think we don't talk enough about, uh, you know, we can do a lot of things, but the why we do it and should we do it is also, I think, conversations that we need to have.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, it's great that you have mentioned this actually, because like an immediate book comes to mind. I'm wondering if you've read Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus. Chance?
Yeah,
You have? Okay, cool. I can see from the smile on
a
your
long
face that
time
it
ago,
seems
though.
to kind of like evoke like that idea in there. But if you were to think about some whys, right, that seem to kind of go together with, I guess, your present passion. Um, do you have like a sense of what those might be?
So I think the weird thing about health is that people just associate that with like doctors and nurses, when
Mm-hmm.
actually for me, health is a fundamental human condition and everything affects health. And so when I did my master's in public health in London, I think that's so I went from like microbiology and molecular biology, looking at very, very small things,
Mm-hmm.
to public health and policy, which essentially is looking at population-wide interventions.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at that bigger picture, health is about urban planning. Do you have green spaces? Do you have pedestrian walkways? Are
Mm-hmm.
you encouraging people to be physically active? You're talking about water and air quality because that affects people's health. You're talking
Mm-hmm.
about food security. You're talking about the effects of poverty and education. And so a lot of it is so intertwined. And I think that the challenge that we have right now with a lot of our policy is that it's very much siloed by Kementerian. And at the end of the day, if you look at the why, I mean, when you talk about health, you want a population for a country, you want a population that is healthy because presumably they will be more productive over a longer period of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but how you go about doing that is actually not just about making sure that people have access to doctors and nurses. It's about looking at a very wide cross section, preventive health, talking about even things like free meals in schools, because you know that if children don't get adequate nutrition at a very early age, that affects their lifetime
Mm-hmm.
propensity to, their IQ levels, their propensity to get diabetes and heart disease and all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's yeah, there's a lot of big questions that we ask actually, and it's not, and we don't want to have that conversation just with doctors and nurses. We should be
Mm-hmm.
having those conversations with economists, with
Mm-hmm.
urban planners, with,
Mm-hmm.
you know, yeah, a lot of different parties, I guess.
I see. I think that ties in with a curiosity that I have about, well, what you've chosen to do with like the masters. So I think that masters was in like public health nutrition, right? But a lot of these things essentially that you've mentioned, like essentially collaborations, built environment, and various other things of that nature. I mean, policy making, I mean, would that be something that you might explore in the future? Like, well, potentially in like a political career or like something else along the way that might place you, I guess, in that situation to determine the future of the human race, or at the very least, Malaysia in particular.
I mean, the thing is right now, like everyone can contribute. A lot of times when policymakers are developing policies, they do elicit
Mm.
feedback from people.
Ah, I
And
see.
in my capacity as a CEO, I have attended many, many of these sessions discussing with policymakers, because what is most important is coming with a different point of view. What you don't want is just talking to one segment of people, or people who only come from one point of view, and
Mm-hmm.
then you basically don't have a policy that works on the ground. So yes, I have always been interested in strategy, looking at the impact of things. And we've already been doing that. And I think that's the point as well, is I don't think that just because you work in the private sector that you have no influence, or you don't have a responsibility to influence policy, right? You could speak up.
Mm-hmm.
When people are discussing policies, you can educate yourself, you can educate your friends and family members, you can have those
Mm-hmm.
conversations. And overall, I believe that raises the quality of the conversation, it raises the quality of the outcome of the policy. Because if people don't understand why the
Mm-hmm.
government is coming out with this policy, then more likely than not, the outcome is not going to be what they envisioned. And so
Mm-hmm.
everybody needs to play a part. And it goes back to, what does it mean to be an educated person
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in society?
Wow, okay. Thank you so much for that. Well, I guess maybe would you share, I guess, how moving essentially from management consulting over to becoming the CEO of a hospital was, I guess, an expression of how you manifested, well, your choices kind of like day by day to actualize like that education that you had received at Harvard. Like how or in what way do you feel that it was the fruit really of some of the things that you had encountered along the way?
So I guess, so I went into consulting and I did an internship at BCG in the KL office. And then
Mm,
basically that was my junior year. And at the end of my internship, they offered me a job. So honestly, when I graduated, I was like homesick. I didn't want to stay in Boston anymore because it's freaking miserable in winter. I wanted to
sorry to
come
hear that.
home, and BCG had offered me a job. So I was like, brilliant. So I came home. I worked for BCG for 2 years, and I
Mm,
think it was great because coming from a science background, you go into management consulting, and they do invest in training to make sure that you understand the bits of business, right? Like that was where I learned what financial statements were,
mm,
what how how companies are run and things like that. It was like, what mini pre-MBA, I guess. So that was very good training for me. But then I realized that if you want to be running a company, you need to be in the operations, and BCG
mm,
was great for strategy, but you're not running a department, you're not responsible for profit and loss, you don't do like capital expenditure or operational expenditure budgeting. You don't do all of that because
mm,
you're essentially just hired to do the research and come up with the strategy, and you hand it
mm,
over to be executed. So I wanted to
mm,
learn the execution part. So that's
mm,
why I left BCG and ended up in Sunway. And yeah, so I started in Sunway Medical as marketing and communications because in a hospital, I wasn't an allied health professional, wasn't a nurse,
mm,
wasn't a doctor. So I picked something that was more like a general function and sort of expanded from there. But I always think that business development and marketing is interesting because fundamentally your job is how to grow a business. And that is the single most important function for a CEO.
mm,
And so I learned a lot in my time
mm,
at Sunway. So, I started off as director of marketing only because there was a new CEO that joined, and a lot of people, normally when there's a change of CEO, there are a lot of people who resign, follow the old CEO. So there are a lot of vacancies basically in the
mm,
organization all of a sudden. And so I had an opportunity to take up the challenge and just went from there. So yeah, so I was able to, work my way up in a relatively short period of time to become a CEO.
I see. Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing that. And do you feel actually, this is something that I have been curious about for a while. So, like, if we consider, for example, a person's educational background, right? So, like, when you think really about that aspect of like your college right there, do you feel that maybe there was something in college that was causative in eventually allowing you to become able to lead an organization? Because, like, in that respect to that, like, that must require a ton of different things and the ability to administrate lots of different things at the same time. Do you feel that there was something causative or formative at Harvard that allowed you to be able to do that? Or do you feel that maybe that there is no such thing and ultimately it's just random chance and also perhaps, right, like just the nature of the people who might choose to undertake that educational decision to attend Harvard in the first place?
Well, I think, okay, if you look at what are the skill sets that are needed to be a CEO, I think
Right.
number one, having a vision is really important. And having a vision means that you have to set a direction, you're not following somebody.
Mm,
And so setting a direction means you need to look at what's around you and then you come to a conclusion, what's the way that we want to go, right? And I think that a lot of what we do in university is actually asking those questions, right? You do your research. For example, you have to write a paper on something. And it's really training you to think about digesting information and coming up
mm,
with a conclusion and coming up with the facts to support that conclusion.
mm,
And and so training you to digest information and make a decision, come to a conclusion, A, is really important.
mm,
B, I think having been exposed to so many different topics and people is also really important because communication is also about understanding your audience, being able to connect with them at some level.
mm,
And so that helps if you're exposed to a lot of different ideas and a lot of different people. from the beginning. So that is also something. And then the third thing is being able to work under pressure. So the thing
Mm,
that I realized about going to Harvard was like when
mm,
you're in Harvard, everybody's going through the same thing. So it doesn't really seem like it's any different for you. But then I had also friends who were attending other universities, and you realize that the pace of what we do at Harvard was actually maybe 2 or 3 times more than what students in another university would be facing. So for example, typical subject, you take like 4 to 6 subjects at most, and a typical subject would have 600 pages of reading a week that you had to go through, and then you
mm,
had to write a paper or two about it, and then
mm,
you multiply that by all your subjects. So
mm,
the intensity of the work was quite high, and of course Harvard's full of type A people as well. um,
okay.
so it's really about setting the benchmark. I still remember, so when I was at Harvard, it's a requirement that all students have to have a second language.
Mm,
So either if you've not studied a second language, you have to take a second language at Harvard. Now the problem is I did Sekolah Kebangsaan all the way, but when I got to Harvard, there was nobody who could test my Malay.
oh,
So on paper, like
okay.
nobody could testify that I was fluent in Malay. So I ended up taking like French at Harvard. And so I signed up for
Wow.
basic French, French 1A. And then I go to this class and I realized like actually the people who think they're like basic beginner French had already taken like 3 years of French in high school. Like,
Mhm.
but they just think that they're not good enough. And so it's just like when you surround yourself with people who are holding themselves up to such a high standard, I think it's also really important who you surround yourself with, because
Mm,
that's where you naturally set a benchmark of what you expect out of yourself.
I see. Cool. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, this might seem like a dumb question. It probably is a dumb question, but do you feel that people with liberal arts educations are more inclined to become CEOs as compared to, like, say, people of other educational backgrounds potentially?
No, I don't necessarily think so. I think with the liberal arts, I think you would see that they would go on to be more self-directed and end up founding companies,
Ah, I
right?
see. Okay.
Because the expectation is even in your own education. So I went to the US for my undergrad and I went to the UK for my postgrad. And when I was in the UK education system, it's very much like what we expect in Malaysia. You sign up for a program, these are the
Mm,
classes you have to take, and everything is already planned for you. Just as
mm,
long as you go through your classes, you ace your exams, there's your degree qualification. So you
mm.
contrast that to a liberal arts education, they're like, what do you want to do? You decide your classes, you decide your timetable, you decide whether you want to show up for class or not. Okay, if you fail, it's your responsibility. And so I think that was one of the things that really struck me when I went to Harvard was how much they treat you like an adult. Because
Mm,
honestly, sometimes being a student in Malaysia,
mm,
you're just being told what to do.
mm,
And so you had students who actually didn't turn up for class. Some failed, some just crammed at the year end and got passing grade. Some students arranged their timetable so they only had to go to class for four. They had a 3-day,
mm.
4-day weekend, so they only like did their classes, crammed all their classes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then the rest of the week they were just like partying, having fun. So it was just like in a closed environment, you are free to decide how you want to live your life, and it's basically a training ground for what you would do outside.
I see. Okay, cool. Now, in speaking then of the outside, I'd like to transition now into a discussion of, well, your membership in the Harvard Club of Malaysia. Well, if you could, maybe, would you share a little bit about how you went from graduating, coming back to becoming a part of, I guess, like the Harvard community in Malaysia, and then eventually coming on to, I guess, becoming the Harvard Club's president?
So I think, well, basically there are not many Harvard alumni anyway in Malaysia. So you
Mm,
come back, you kind of are already in the group just because it's such a small group.
mm,
And really, I think why I continue to be involved in the Harvard Club was quite simple. Number one is you want to still connect with the people who went to the university, because obviously it was such a formative experience for all of us that we
mm,
have very fond memories of it. But more importantly, I think the club was set up with an educational purpose. And so it is to raise awareness about liberal arts education, which we strongly believe in well, I strongly believe it's a more superior way of having a university education. Um, and it's
You become
also
CEO. I'm kidding.
you become
Sorry, I'm
CEO.
sorry.
And we also have a charitable endeavors, So our flagship program is a Harvard Prize book, and essentially that program is actually global, worldwide. A lot of Harvard alumni actually run this program in many, so I think 100 over different countries. But what the program does is that it simulates the university admissions process for high school students. And really, I think the disadvantage that we Malaysians have compared to students in the US is that there is no guidance because the road to higher education is so set up for you. When you are faced with a system like the US, where you have to go through interviews, you have to write a personal essay, you have to talk about who you are beyond your grades, a lot of students are not used to that. And so the whole point was to actually start simulating that process early on, to actually get them to start thinking about what are you going to write in your college application essay? Like, who are you, Victor? Tell me,
Oh
what
my
is it
gosh, am
that
I
you're
being
passionate
interviewed
about in
right here?
life, right? And so that's one of the things that we do, and we currently do it for about 25 disadvantaged schools in Malaysia,
Okay.
where the alumni come together, and together with the school, we sit in, we interview the students just like how they would be applying for Harvard. And then we give the best one a book and a cash prize from the club. So that has been going on for quite some time. And then also representing Harvard University in terms of talking to students about university admissions and applications. And another reason why we're so passionate about it is because Harvard believes that if you are good enough to be admitted, then we will make sure that you can afford to come to Harvard. And so that aspect of financial aid from Harvard is also something that we really want to raise awareness
Oh yeah.
about to Malaysians, because essentially money should not be a reason why you don't get an education. And so Harvard's been amazingly lucky to have one of the largest endowments in the world. And so your admission to Harvard is need blind. They don't ask you whether you can afford to attend and make a decision based on that. So your admission decision is purely based on your merit. And if you are admitted, they will look at your financial resources, and then they will just give you financial aid to make sure that you'll be able to attend. And so I think that's a remarkable opportunity for students, especially coming from this side of the world, where, they may not be able to afford the tuition fees, and they think that it's a pipe dream, but actually they just need to make sure that, academically, intellectually, that they would be able to contribute to the environment at Harvard. And then the financial part is actually not a problem.
Yeah. And also just for numbers right there, correct me if I'm wrong. If your annual income is essentially below 85,000 US dollars, or essentially 375,000 ringgit thereabouts, then you'll be able to attend Harvard for free. Is that right? Roughly speaking?
I'm not sure, because they kept revising the thing.
I see.
So there is a whole website on Harvard financial aid, but essentially the other thing to also consider is that they don't discriminate between international students and American students,
I
right? If
see.
you are an international student, you get the same financial aid, which is not always the case with universities. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I have a page here actually. It does say right here, Harvard costs what your family can afford. If your family's income is less
There
than
you go.
$85,000, you'll pay nothing.
And
So,
85,000 excludes home equity. So they don't count like the value of your home, because they know it's not like your family's going to sell their house, right? To send you to Harvard. So
oh yeah, for sure.
85,000, there's also it excludes certain assets as well.
hmm There you go. No American college is more affordable. Wow. That definitely does sound like a great incentive for people to just, wherever they are, like develop themselves, push themselves to kind of become the very best version of themselves. And thank you for that. I think that you do a great. Actually, wait. before that, I do have some questions that I sourced from the class of 2028 for you. From Mr. Brian Luo Ting, who, by the way, observed that today is May the 4th. It's Star Wars Day. I did not know that before. um, there was no question. He just asked me to tell you that you are a wonderful asset for our country and you are doing a great service for our society.
Oh, thank you. And may the fourth be with you too.
Indeed. Okay, cool. And then from Mr. Victor Ngao, who didn't know that he was going to attend Harvard until recently, actually. He asks, was there a career decision that perhaps you wish that you could have made, but that you did not at an earlier point of your life?
No, like I said, like always make decisions that without regret, you know.
I see.
So when I decided to leave BCG, a lot of people thought I was crazy because BCG associate pay is the same worldwide. You
Mm,
pay denominated in US dollars. And so my starting salary as a fresh graduate was about 12,000 ringgit.
mm,
And to, you know, contrast that with a normal average graduate pay of 3,000,
mm,
when I decided to resign and join Sunway, they
mm,
were like, "You're crazy."
mm,
But I think at the time, you know, I was like 20 something, and I thought, you know, I think it's more important that I actually go and learn something
mm,
instead of, I mean, because being a consultant had a lot of perks, like you had good pay, was an MNC, a lot of
mm,
you know, expense claims, a lot of travel. But for me, what was important is, am I learning anything new?
mm,
And yeah, I never regretted that decision. But I think if I had listened to a lot of people, maybe I would have if I didn't leave. So yeah, so I think, you know, we're all responsible and it's your life to live. That's the key thing, right? So you have you make the decision. I firmly believe this. You make the decision and you're the one living with your consequences. So at the end of the day, you better be comfortable with whatever decision you're making. And
mm,
you can take inputs from other people, but it's still your life.
mm. Okay, thank you. From Miss Tamini Vijayasingam, she asks, what is it like to run the Harvard Alumni Club? She may or may not have visions of becoming a president one fine day, so like I'll leave it to you to chat with her. But yeah, like what is it like? Do you guys meet like very often? And then I guess like what is the general vibe, I guess?
Okay, so the thing is that a lot of people in the Harvard Club, because they're Harvard alumni, usually have very busy jobs.
Mm,
And, you know, once you are a certain age, you have your family. So a lot of us are really busy. But what's the great thing is that none of us are paid, right, to do this. And we're doing it on an entirely voluntary basis because we believe strongly in the educational objectives
mm,
and the things that we're doing. And also sometimes, you know, just the social aspect of it. So we could probably do more, but
mm,
recognizing that a lot of times people are just doing this voluntarily out of like whatever small sliver
mm,
of spare time that they have. And so we try to focus on things that bring the most impact. So
mm,
for example, last year we definitely want to run the prize book program, and we want to make sure that it's financially sustainable. So you got to,
mm,
you know, look at fundraising and things like that. We also want to look at how to raise awareness about Harvard and Harvard applications. So, you know, our alumni will go and talk to student
mm,
groups and things like that. So yeah, it's primarily a social group with
mm,
people who share like similar ideals and are passionate about the value of education and how that
mm.
can transform your life, because most of us
Wonderful.
actually did undergo that.
I see. Okay. And from Miss Eliza is having IB exams right now, so technically there's no question. I'll give one to you on behalf of her. As a Harvard alumnus, have you ever dreamt of taking over the world?
Uh, no, I think that would be a lot of work. And really, it's like, yeah, I'm
Okay.
happy not to. But I think as a Harvard alumni, a lot of the world may look to you for answers.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. So, incidentally, I'm curious, right? But you've been interviewing, well, Harvard admits essentially for like years upon years now. Has it not been? I mean, like, unless of course, like, my appreciation for time has been
Yeah,
blunted
17
over the years.
years.
17 years of interviewing people. And like it's become like almost an archetype, like in the newspaper. I see basically the faces of people like just splayed out. Look, like this is like a thing. Like basically, yeah, something like this. You have pictures basically, on, I guess like, well, the newspaper, Harvard, I don't know, he's not a girl, clearly, but anyway, then you have something like this right here. So yeah, I mean, like, but I think partially it's also because, well, you guys like submit like press statements to the press and stuff of that nature. I guess my question for you then is, why is it that you feel that it is maybe desirable to, I guess, like showcase, well, exceptional talent like these young ones that you have right here? And I guess, like, what do you see as maybe the reason that you feel that that's worthwhile to keep doing like year after year?
Yeah, because actually it's kind of a lot of work to like write up a press release and go and email it. But basically we do it because we want to raise awareness. And when
Mm,
I was admitted to Harvard, I was the only one in my year. And there was like, a period in the early 2000s where there were no Malaysians admitted to Harvard.
mm-hmm,
And trust me, it's not because there were no Malaysians who deserved to be admitted to Harvard. It is
mm-hmm,
because people didn't, either they were intimidated, they didn't
mm-hmm,
know what was the process. And I think the whole thing about celebrating the admissions of these students is to demonstrate that A, they come from various backgrounds. They're not all from Klang Valley. They're
mm-hmm,
not all from well-off families.
mm-hmm,
Actually, majority of them come from the national public education system, not
mm-hmm,
private schools.
mm-hmm,
And so, and we do know that, like, for example, the article that you showed, like Xu Xian from Ipoh,
mm-hmm.
she applied because she read the previous year there was another girl from Ipoh who applied, and then she thought, okay,
Za.
if that girl can get in, maybe I can apply and I have a shot of getting in.
Okay.
And so it does have an impact on raising awareness and giving students the hope that they could also be attending Harvard, that
Ah,
financial aid is a thing, that
I see.
you don't,
Mm,
if you come from a public school doesn't mean you're disadvantaged.
mm,
And we have seen the admission rates from Malaysia actually increase substantially
mm.
since we started doing this.
I
So
see.
it has
Wonderful.
had a positive impact. And I got to thank the media for always graciously, because we obviously don't pay them. But
Uh,
I think it's also really nice that it's one of the pieces of news that actually unite Malaysians together to
mm,
celebrate the success of young people who are obviously competing at a global level. I
mm,
mean, the admission rate at Harvard is like 3%.
mhm.
There's a lot of applications from all over the world.
Okay.
Um, and so I think that it's always a nice thing to see Malaysians also come together and celebrate these talent.
Wow. Indeed, for sure. Um, can I ask you a controversial question, a potentially controversial question, one that may be dangerous in nature right here. I,
Go ahead.
who is your favorite member of the class of 2028?
Hmm. I think they're all different in many ways.
Ooh, Harvard
Yeah.
answer. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I admire Thamini because she took a gap year, and that's something.
Wow. Okay.
She took a gap year. She prioritized her family, and that's a very mature outlook for somebody her
Hmm.
age. Um, Victor also had a lot of challenges that went on in his life, and I think it's amazing that he got to where he was, having done that. Brian was a very interesting person. He's so quiet.
Hmm.
And then you literally have to dig out all these gems from him, like, oh, you were like a basketball star. You designed this app. Like, tell me more. Why are you keeping this all to
Wow.
yourself?
Malaysian Jeremy Lin.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, they're very, and Elisa, coming from Johor, being so passionate about politics and social media and raising awareness. And it's incredible, like what she's done, just like cold calling people and just going out there and
Mm,
grabbing all these opportunities. They're all
mm,
special in many ways. And the fact that I
mm,
can remember all these stories about them that just demonstrates that, like, that's the kind of
mm,
like people that you want as friends, as people around
mm,
you, because they've been through such interesting journeys. They have their own point of view and they're just getting started. And you just
mm,
kind of like know that, wherever they end up,
mm.
it's going to be good for the world and it's going to be an interesting time.
I imagine, yeah. All right. And then now, maybe slightly less controversial, but may require you to think a little bit right there. Excluding the class of 2028 and considering the entire swath of like the different people that you've interviewed throughout the course of the years, of course, a Harvard interview is not something that you can get selected for just randomly. So I'm sure that you've had many interesting people. What is one interesting conversation, or perhaps the most interesting conversation that you had in all of these like 17 years, excluding the current year?
Interesting conversations. Okay, the first thing is, if they weren't interesting conversations, we probably wouldn't have recommended them for admission. Um, that's
Okay.
actually one of the questions they ask, like, was the flow of conversation easy? And it's really, I think when we approach these interviews, it's not like we're the senior and you're the junior.
Mm-hmm.
What we're trying to ascertain is like, if tomorrow they were my roommate, would I be happy?
Mm-hmm.
Like, can we be friends?
Mm,
So the most interesting conversations are when people talk about themselves as people, either their personal histories or the things that they're really passionate about.
mm-hmm.
And it's not just an answer because you think that that's what the interviewer wants to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we had interviews that was entirely about Harry Potter, and the Potterverse. We've had interviews where it was nothing serious, really, because Harvard has all your test scores, they have your school records. We're not interested in like, well, are you like academically sound? But what we want to know is that, are you an interesting person? Are
Mm,
you asking interesting questions? And with the resources that you have, what interesting things have you done?
mm, amazing, cool. And of course, well, the time for our interview is coming to an end, and I want to thank you so much for your time so far, and also in respecting your time. But if I may ask one final question, if that's okay.
Sure.
In your opinion, what should the next generation of Malaysians, class of 2029, 2030, or otherwise, do, right? If they are interested in, for example, attending Harvard, like what are some things that they can do right now, wherever it is that they are, and whatever their circumstances, to maximize their chances of one day walking on the pathway that you had walked on all those years ago?
So I think they need to start asking the questions about themselves. Who are they as people? What are the things that they value? What are the things that they're passionate about? Where do they see opportunity to contribute? Because these are not questions and things that you can do overnight or read a book and cram
Mm,
and the way you would for an exam. But you need to constantly be asking the why,
mm,
because at the end of the day, when you say you do something and people ask you why, you need to have a credible answer. So a lot
mm,
of times you don't want to miss out on this self-reflection and this curiosity. You may not have the answer, but at least you're thinking about it. And really what
mm,
the university wants to know is, how is this person's thinking process?
mm,
Um, and obviously, as I said, everyone at Harvard has very high expectations of themselves. Whatever you choose to do, you want to excel in it, or at least show that you've done the best that you can with whatever resources that you've had.
mm,
So I think take the time to sit down and ask these questions. Like, for example, if you say you apply to Harvard and you want to do economics, obviously the next question is why.
mm,
And if you haven't sat down and really thought about why you're interested in this, is it
mm,
because, your parents told you so, you had a relative
mm.
that was an economist? I
A
mean,
guy
those
told a
are like,
guy. Mm,
those are not sort of like the deep thinking that you would expect or the university would expect. So
mm,
taking the time to take a step back and really thinking about who you want to be as a person, how you want to contribute, why you're doing the things that you're doing, and then doing them well to achieve your objectives is really the thing that you need to be doing. And that is not something that you can do overnight.
Wow. Thank you so much for your insight. And thank you so much for your time as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope I didn't bore people to death, but
Definitely 150% under.
we'll see.
Whoa. Yeah, for all we know, like I'll get like a whole bunch of like stalkers just being all like, yes. It's already happening, but for various reasons. I'll tell you about it later. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Wan Nadiah, Harvard Club president, Harvard interviewer, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on this channel, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yes, amazing, cool.